Okay, so today we're going to look at criticisms of dualism. Um, these are going to look mainly at criticisms of Descartes' dualism, but they equally apply to Plato's dualism, really. So, what are the big criticisms? Before we get into what they are, I think there are two kind of elements of Descartes' reasoning or theory that are really important here to understand before we see what the big problems with them are. The first one over here is the interaction between the two. And it's an interaction, importantly, between something that is unextended, that is non-physical, that is the mind, the unextended mind, and the that arrow is not long enough, is it? And the extended brain, so the physical brain. Remember, unextended here for the mind has this kind of concept that it doesn't have measurements, it doesn't have sides or atoms or anything like that. It exists in no particular place even, but it is your consciousness. Whereas the brain, of course, is extended. It has a particular place. Now, the important thing for us to remember here is that they interact. Okay, so that's Descartes' idea for the interaction. On the other side, the other thing we need to talk about is how Descartes knows that the mind exists. And Descartes knows this through what we call introspection. So I know that my mind exists because I look at it. I can see it inside. So introspection is simply seeing inside. That's why he says, cogito ergo sum. Do you remember what that means? It means I think, therefore I am. But of course, I'm the one that's experiencing my thinking. So this introspection, which is something that only I can experience, proves to me that my mind exists. Okay, so those are the two parts that are really important. The interaction between the non-physical mind and the physical brain, and the introspection here being the thing that leads me to conclude that my mind exists. So let's now look at the two criticisms. Here they are. One is the criticism of the interaction, and the other is a criticism concerning other minds. Let's start with the criticism of interaction, which has typically been known as by far the biggest problem for Cartesian dualism. The problem of interaction was put pretty well by Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. So Descartes was part of that first intellectual movement that used to correspond, used to write via letters that would then be published later on. And in a letter to Descartes, Elizabeth poses this problem. She says, look, in physical objects, in extended objects, they have kind of sides. God, it's going to be very small. They have sides. And these sides push into each other. That is how causation happens, like this. Bang! And the interaction occurs. That's how physical interaction happens, she says. But of course, if Descartes' right in his thinking, then you don't have two things with sides. You only have one with a side, and the other is unextended, right? The mind is unextended, and it has no sides. Well, how can something that only interacts by essentially pushing or bumping into each other interact with something that has no ability to push or bump? Well, she concludes if this is the case, then there can't, she thinks, be interaction between the mind and the brain. this criticism has been developed a lot more. We now talk about the universe being a causally closed system. That is, in the physical world, there can be no kind of escaping of causation. The causation can only happen within the physical world. Well, how does Descartes reply to this? He says, well, look, it might be something to do with like kind of weight, that, you know, weight doesn't involve pushing as such, but Elizabeth doesn't like that very much. She thinks that that breaks the kind of mechanistic understanding of nature. Instead, Descartes ultimately just says, okay, I don't know. Descartes says, I don't know how it works. But it must. Because he's proved it. Because he has kind of experience of that inside. Because of my introspection. My introspective experience. Okay. I experience my mind telling me to do telling my body to do something, and then my body doing it. So it must happen. Elizabeth isn't particularly convinced by this. In fact, in response to the weight argument that Descartes gave before, Elizabeth says, you know, I'd rather believe in an extended mind than in no explanation at all. Let's move on now to the problem of other minds, because this involves, of course, introspective knowledge. Well, the problem of other minds can be summed up like this. I know my mind exists because of introspection, but I can't... Oh, wow, that is the wrong colour. I apologise. I can't see other people's minds. Now, if I can't see others' minds, I can only see kind of their behaviour. How do I know that you, for instance, or anybody else, someone who's kind of just stood around claiming they are conscious, actually is conscious? Well, of course, I can't. So I can't know. If the only way to know that the mind exists is through introspection, I can't know other people are conscious. So I can't know there are other minds. Now that really messes with our kind of conception of life, I suppose. We tend to want to think that other people are conscious, but if dualism is true, it seems to imply that other people may not be conscious. Well, what's the response to this? One response comes from John Stuart Mill. Now, John Stuart Mill gives an argument by analogy. He says that, look, in me, here's me over here. I have a body, and I have a mind. And that body and mind, that is a very big mind, that body and mind, they interact, right? And I experience that. I experience it in what he calls a law-like way. In other words, every time I think, oh, raise my right hand, well, my right hand rises. So the connection between my mind and my body is very strong. He says, well, if that's true here, if this law-like connection is true here, then it would also apply to other people as well. Others that I don't see their minds. They must also have some form of law-like connection. If they are behaving like me and claiming to have consciousness, then of course they must also have a conscious mind. Okay, so those are two criticisms of Cartesian dualism. One is that there is a big problem with the interaction between the mind and the brain, that they just can't possibly interact. And the other is that even if they could, we wouldn't know that other minds exist.